Good evening to everyone. Very warm welcome to Farmers Weekly's webinar. I'm Susie Horn, business editor at Farmers Weekly. I grew up on farms in East Yorkshire and North Yorkshire, where my brothers both farm arable and sheep, and I've been writing for Farmers Weekly for most of my working life. We've got a great panel tonight. Many thanks to them for giving up their time. They've got lots of experience. In fact, Rob from Bidwells and Charlie from Farrer and Co. both have more than 3 decades of experience in their field, so we're going to get lots of good advice tonight. They both advise farmers and landowners on development and its implications, as does Ian McVicker, who you'll hear from later. So we're going to hear more about the concept of legacy development tonight, and the tax and legal issues that go with that. First, we've got Rob Hopwood from Bidwells. He's a partner in the firm. He's got extensive experience in the field and leads the firm's Oxford-Cambridge ARC team, advising clients on development opportunities and planning strategy in that growth corridor. Increasingly, sustainable development is a key part of many of the projects that Rob works on, and increasingly also they involve a partnership between a landowner and a developer. On the legal front, we've got Charlie Anderson, who's a partner in the law firm Farrer and Co. And Charlie's best known in rural circles for his work with estates and individual landowners at all scales. And the emphasis again is often on sustainable mixed-use community developments in Charlie's work. Ian McVicker is head of the Farms and Estates team at accountant Albert Goodman. He'll be talking about the tax aspects of development. Ian's got a very strong practical background in farm advice, having been a farm business consultant before qualifying as an accountant. And he specialises in strategic tax and business advice for farmers and estate owners, along with other types of rural business. They'll each make a short presentation, and then we'll open things up for discussion. You can ask a question at any time by typing into the box at the foot of your screen, and I'll direct those questions to the panel as we go along. Don't hold back with the questions, whatever the subject. If we can't answer it today, we may try and get back to you post the webinar with some advice. We'll also be running a couple of polls during the session. Those will just appear on your screen, so just submit your answers when you see them. The webinar will last about an hour, and then afterwards it will be available as a recording, and you'll get an email to let you know when that's ready. Our first speaker, Rob Hopwood, and then we'll move to Charlie Anderson.
Actually, this webinar is about legacy development and what it means and the opportunities that may be able to bring to landowner farmers in particular. So what I thought I would do is, as an introduction, is what actually is legacy development, so we all know what we're talking about. And I'll talk about it from a planner's perspective. I mean, there's obviously various different definitions, but I've been talking to my colleagues across the rural, residev and planning divisions, and we've come up with a simple definition to start the ball rolling. We're saying it's planning and building high quality, sustainable development and communities for our future generations, which deliver tangible benefits that all can be proud of. So it's quite a simple statement. I can tell you what it's not. We've had a few inquiries about us being able to write some wills for people, financial matters in wills, and we said we can't really do that, so we can recommend good solicitors, and one is on the call. What are the types of legacy development we could be talking about today, to give you a flavour? And of course they vary in scale and size, and because of that, in the time scales it takes to plan and deliver, and then obviously later on keep that going in terms of land estate management. So obviously we'll know historically there's some interesting big ones. Bourneville in 1893 by George Cadbury in Birmingham, and we've obviously got Types Salt in 1851, looking at better conditions for his workers. And then, of course, more recently, Prince Charles at Poundbury is a well-known example. But of course, they're all large-scale estate-scale development. But what we look at as legacy development, it can start from simple farm diversification, which under the new regulations you can do without resorting to planning. under prior notification. And then we go up through various mixed developments. There's a well-known one we've dealt with over the last 30 years at Beaconsfield, an estate there, where we've looked at some underperforming assets on the estate, and we've managed to get a vision through the landowner there by creating a mixed development off the high street, including shops, services, offices, holiday lets, rental properties and the like. And of course that estate can then go forward with other ideas going forward. And of course the key to all this is really, the most important thing is, as the landowner got a vision for what they want to do, and when they want to do it by. And of course a lot of that is about their own ideas, ancestral ideas they want to carry through, and what can they go for the future generations in terms of their children and grandchildren and how they might benefit, as well as the local community. Some obviously estates have trustees as well, and of course they will need to agree perhaps a way forward at various meetings and how they want to do it. A vision can be bold and innovative, but of course what we need to do as advisors is make sure that vision is a viable one, and the proposition in planning terms is actually practical and deliverable. And we have to look at the reasons for why the landowner wants to go through with a vision, and what the reasons are, so get underneath the skin of that. For instance, a real visionary proposal we've been involved in is the Wilderwood at Horning on the Norfolk Broads near Norwich, and Tom Blowfield there had a vision to create a fantasy woodland world as a tourist attraction, which is very successful indeed. And of course now, because that's a water and forest based area, is looking at now the future environmental protection and how you can actually create benefits in a natural environment. Also, we've got examples where we're dealing with film studios in Hertfordshire, and the landowner there wants to make it the best in the UK, if not the world. And interestingly, that's a hopefully we're a joint venture. They'll keep the freehold on that, but of course also the community is involved in that, and that's a really important facet of legacy development. So looking at that, going a bit further, what are the conditions required through planning and actually agreements to make these things happen? And a lot to do with local government intentions and local plans, timing and their housing need, as well as other factors. And also we now know that Michael Gove is our new minister on levelling up, etc. Is a very great arbiter of building back better, and he's now looking at a new way of planning. We don't think the changes in the planning system are going to be as dramatic as they promised, and I think a more let's return to localism and neighbourhood plans might be the way forward. So we need to look out for that, and that might be a useful way of moving forward with certain proposals in the local area. So get the right developer and promoter on board. So it's all about the working relationship, keeping the reputation of the landowners going. Also, I think the viability is another key factor. And Charlie will talk a bit more about this in a moment.
Thanks, Susie. Thanks, Rob. And I've got some slides popping up here. I'm going to speak to some of the principal elements of legacy projects and the legal context around those. Dare I say issues. These are the matters that emerge as terms of the deal and often substantially parts of the negotiations that lead to the relevant legal structure and actually right the way down to the detail of the legal documents. But really, by way of introduction, the guiding project principles for the landowner are the high quality master planning and design. And hence, that's why it's a stewardship and legacy project, not a commoditized housing development that we see out there, not a develop and disappear type project. And really, because the objective here is to secure the desired returns, financial and social. And financial, increasingly, we're seeing evidence from surveyors, from the College of Estate Management, from the Prince's Foundation, from the BBBC, that the financial returns on these projects, now we're 20 years in, 30 years in, places like Poundbury, the evidence is there if there's the patient capital and the patience for the longer term return. And also the social return we're seeing out there in this world of ESG delivery, ESG benchmarking, we see from the health, the education, the well-being that comes through on these projects is increasingly evidenced and visible. So all of that, again, to enhance the reputation of the landowner taking it forward, whether it's for himself, whether it's for successors, or whether there's a retained estate that will derive benefit from it. So a lot of this leads me in the legal world to the landowner control and input in the structures, the legal structures and the documentation. And it breaks down into two periods: the development period, which is really working up the design to planning, and then the build out, the construction according to planning. And then secondly, the estate management period. Once it's finished, the services and works to keep it going, and the alterations control. And Rob mentioned the scale of projects. Well, obviously, we can speak today to new settlements of many thousand houses, or actually even down to 10 dwelling units. I'd like to think the same principles apply, although there may be greater levels of infrastructure, greater public realm. There's a lot in common here about the principles that work. Indeed, nothing new. Estate development we did very well decades, if not hundreds of years ago. It's just making sure we get back on track now. So next slide, please. Yeah, so the principal stakeholders for the landowner tend to be my clients. Design is obviously key. And historically, the principal elements of design have been about the external layout, appearance, and materials, whether it's the residential, the commercial, community, public realm, public facilities. But increasingly, there's a design element in the sustainable elements within the buildings themselves, which there didn't used to be 20 years ago, but increasingly a feature. The other stakeholder, obviously the developer, well, as we all know, it's the cost of construction and the ability to sell dwellings are absolutely key. And this brings me to the main feature of the negotiations, the terms, the legal documents that I get involved with, and it's balancing or finding a structure whereby you've got landowners' discretionary control over the project as against protective provisions for the developer. Viability, Rob mentioned, choosing the right developer, very important, but it's finding a balance of ensuring its legacy because of discretionary control, but at the same time allowing the developer some degree of flexibility and certainty. So next slide, please. So on the projects, we try in the documents, the legal structure, to find a way of aligning these interests to bring certainty. And we set out common aspiration statements, we have common aspiration documents, so clear objectives of what the legacy is. And key to this, also a master plan and design codes, which have detailed guidance, rather like a pattern book or a building manual, very detailed, accessible statements about what we're looking for in terms of legacy, rather than the commoditized product. The landowner's architect plays a key role and can be built into the legal structure, especially with a flowchart. They can design a flowchart that can be used to work through the approvals process, to get through to planning permission and deriving some degree of certainty, giving confidence to the developer. In the planning world, we're seeing tools that can help because there's planning regime guidance coming through to respect these types of projects now, legacy rather than commoditized, and they can give us a steer and help align interest. But I suppose a lot of time I spend really putting in dispute resolution clauses. What happens if the parties can't align? And we can put in provisions that make sure that an independent expert can resolve disputes on the basis, obviously, from the landowner's point of view, of the common aspiration and vision. And I never like to get too far from the council and mortgage lenders' requirements, because basically if people can't borrow money to buy the dwelling to the council's satisfaction because the scheme is too onerous on the developer, well, then things don't get sold. Next slide, please. So the legal documents, basically quite simple for the development period. As I say, you've got the provisions for the landowner to approve the design scheme, the work scheme, and the working drawings with the alignment provisions I was just talking about. And then the developer's principal obligations are to build in accordance with the work scheme and the drawings. And an issue in the documents quite often is the landowner's certificate of completion. In some projects, the landowner is able to certify completion, that it's been done properly. But that's a pretty contentious issue, and not a lot of developers will accept that. And also, increasingly, we're putting in, for landowner protection, post-completion snagging and defects provisions. You may have seen government looking at the industry of post-completion defects in dwellings, but we're having to look at putting provisions in contracts to make sure that completed works are properly finished off. Next up, just a short piece on the estate management period. And again, this depends on the size of the project. Infrastructure may be major, public realm may be major, or maybe just an estate road or a public park, a small park. But the objectives are really, once it's built out, to make sure that design scheme is protected and promoted forever through the legacy period. And particularly, there's a proper management structure in the estate for services and works. And the real tools we use in the legal document, I've mentioned the Design and Community Code, something that sets out the standard of alterations and community behaviour. And we also have estate regulations, part of the legal title, again, setting out standards of community behaviour, all enforceable as part of the scheme. And I mentioned planning agreements, which Rob touched on. I mean, in the old days, local authorities dealt with a lot of this estate management and would take it over, but increasingly they don't now. So the planning agreement will be quite prescriptive about how estate management works in terms of public realm, and that's what the landowners will have to look to implement. So finally, last slide on the actual legal provisions for this estate management period. Well, as I say, public realm, increasingly in the legacy schemes, it's going to private management rather than public. And quite often we're looking to have it landowner-led in terms of owning or at least managing the public realm, possibly bringing in a hybrid, which is a community land trust, but sometimes slightly wary of it going straight to a management company run by the residents who might dilute the standards. And as I say, if there is going to be a management company, in the legal constitution, we do like to build in a role for the landowner as a member. So it's not just purely residents, there's a steward's role in there. And also refining the constitution so that there is a commitment to deliver services and works to the appropriate design standards. Sorry, I got ahead of myself. There is one more slide. And just very recently, in terms of the tools that we use, we are increasingly using these management deeds and estate deeds, rather than relying on traditional restrictive covenants and rather imprecise legal obligations, but making sure there's a specific management deed between the landowner and the management company to deliver management. And also we'll have an estate deed between the landowner, the management company and the dwelling owners to provide the services, to pay an estate charge, to comply with the design code, and all council mortgage lenders compliant. So we hope that gets you legacy. We hope that gets you lasting. And I hope it's where we got it now. It's intelligible, it's informative, and it's inspirational. So that's from me.
Susie, you're on mute, if you wouldn't mind. Susie, you're on mute, unfortunately. So I'm just going to introduce. Oh, here we go.
Yeah. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Sorry, everybody. Yeah, thank you very much, Charlie. There's plenty of food for thought there, and I think some of the sort of technical stuff that some of us are not familiar with, we'll deal with some of those in the questions at the end. And Ian, so if you could talk us through now the some of the tax implications of development, that would be great. Thank you. I'll hand over to Ian.
Okay, thank you very much. For those of you who like watching Only Fools and Horses, I think one of their mantras was no income tax, no VAT. Well, unfortunately, that's not the case with a legacy development. So what I'd like to do is just talk through the tax issues with regard to some sort of legacy development on a farm or an estate, and really touch on three taxes, which are income tax, VAT, and then also the inheritance tax as well. I think in terms of my slides, I think they're having a struggle getting them up, but I will just carry on in any case. So with regard to income tax becomes quite important with regard to something like a legacy development. And one of the basics that we use as accountants, and it's worthwhile just remembering the basics, is that income and income tax generally follows the ownership of the property. Therefore, if the ownership is in an individual's name, then once you have built, if you're renting things out, then the rent follows to that individual. If it's owned jointly, then it goes jointly, and trusts, etc., and the same thing follows. With regards to individuals, it's also worthwhile remembering that sort of the first £50,000 of income per year is at lower rates of tax, but once you get above that, then you're going to be paying 40% income tax. Certainly, one of the things that we use quite often with regard to developments is limited companies, where limited companies pay 19% tax. So in essence, if your property is then owned by your company, you effectively half your tax bill. Where a farmer or an estate is developing the assets themselves, one thing that you have to watch is income tax versus capital gains tax on the development. So where you've got bare agricultural land and you get planning permission on it, you've increased the value of it at that point. If you then turn around and say, well, okay, I am going to develop this myself and then sell those assets on, the difference between the value of the land with planning permission and the value that you then sell at could be subject to income tax after allowing for the costs of development. So what you might find is that something that you thought was going to be taxed at 20% for capital gains tax could end up being taxed partially at 20% and partially at 40%. So it's worthwhile getting that sorted out before you start. And one thing I do quite often, so the tip here is where you've got a legacy development or something that's going to generate significant income for a number of years, I use the development to try and spread income around the family. So at least have the conversation with the family beforehand to say, well, okay, who do you want to get the income and how do we do that? Okay. Moving on to VAT. VAT, most people ignore until it's a bit of a problem. And VAT, the problem with VAT is if you've got a farm, you generally charge VAT on your outputs because you charge VAT at 0%. That allows you to claim VAT on all of your inputs. And most farms certainly would think that VAT is a relatively simple tax. You reclaim VAT on everything. Unfortunately, where you change the land use and you're doing other things, then the recovery of VAT becomes a very large issue for those businesses. So for example, if you get planning permission on your land to build a house and you're going to let the house out under an assured short-hold tenancy, a residential rental is VAT exempt, so it's outside the scope of VAT. That means you don't get any VAT back on any of your inputs. So you have to know what you're going to do with something at the end to decide how to deal with it. Holiday lets are different. Holiday lets are chargeable to VAT, so you do get the VAT back on your inputs. So it can be quite complicated. And again, you have the same issues with regard to offices and warehousing, where it might very well be VAT exempt, or if you opt to tax the land, which is that you then decide, you agree with HMRC that you register to tax the land, you charge VAT on your rental income, and that means you can have the VAT back on your inputs in the first instance. So there are ways of doing things that are helpful with regard to VAT. I think the big issue with regard to this is to make sure that you know what you're doing at the beginning and how you're going to do it, and there will be ways that are more efficient than others. And again, my tip, consider options to tax, which is charging VAT on the land and charging VAT on rental income. It's certainly a big issue for a lot of my clients where they've undertaken a lot of development. Finally, I just want to touch on inheritance tax. Inheritance tax is the tax that is payable after you have died, and effectively the tax rate is 40% tax on everything above £325,000. If you're a farmer, farm buildings and farmland are generally inheritance tax free, so that's pretty straightforward. If, however, you change use and you develop a courtyard of barns into some offices or into some housing that is then let out, it has two consequences as far as I can tell for inheritance tax. Firstly, you have increased the value of the land, and secondly, it becomes inheritance taxable. So if you look at my example there, if you take 5 acres of farmland and a courtyard used in a farming business, value £500,000, there's no inheritance tax. If you then take the same 5 acres and you change it into parkland and commercial units, and you increase the value, say, to £2 million, you have an £800,000 inheritance tax bill potentially on that land. So change of use can get you in some hot water with regard to inheritance tax. And one thing, just one tip there, my final tip, is that quite often we look at gifting assets before they are changed in use. And that means you can move assets down a generation whilst they are favourable for inheritance tax purposes, live for your 7 years, and in any practical sense, that gets them outside of inheritance tax. Just finally, what I would say is that all of these taxes need to be taken together, and you need to look at that alongside the commerciality of the project. Don't let the tax tail wag the dog, but do consider the taxes as well. Okay, thank you very much.
That's great. Thanks very much, Ian. Again, lots of food for thought. And I guess just taking one of your recent points, you talked about, having a good plan from the start. And I guess with the decision about VAT and which way to go and opting to tax, particularly if you've got a mixed use development where you've perhaps got live workspaces and commercial let as well, having a really good budget in the first place is probably going to be the best starting point to be able to make decisions about that, I think. Right, so we have some questions from our audience. Some of them pre-notified, some have come in while we've been listening to our experts. First of all, the first one is, what types of arrangements are proving most beneficial to landowners, and what, if anything, should they expect to forego in lieu of what they want? Not quite sure what they're getting at there, but they go on to say, namely, high quality, low carbon and environmentally friendly schemes. So presumably if that's what the landowner wants, what types of arrangements are most beneficial? What, if anything, should they expect to forego or give up in exchange for that? Not quite sure who to go to first on that. Probably Rob, I think.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's a planning related question. All I can comment on is the fact that what councils now expect is a very high bar in terms of, reaching environmental standards, and we're finding much more now that certain councils are leading the way and others are following, whereby any development proposal, they look very hard at what you're doing in terms of energy, water use, biodiversity net gain, planting trees, ecology, you name it. They are starting to impose it, and we're going to find that more and more as we go forward. I can't comment on the rest of the question, I'm afraid.
Okay, so Charlie, would you like, it's probably not a tax one for Ian, but Charlie, would you like to have a go at that one?
Yeah, I mean, from what I see, and obviously not a surveyor, but if you imposing higher build costs and higher sustainable features, you're going to expect the developers offering less in terms of price. But to pick up on Rob's point, I see there is momentum going in this direction, being driven from a number of sources, whether it's planning, as Ian says, whether it's government reviewing individual aspects of house building, from design standards through to, as I mentioned, defects, revising, changing the whole structure for making defects happen. That in this ESG world, environmental, social and governance, I think there is going to be increased benchmarking of these sort of schemes, and one hopes they become the norm. And I'm already hearing surveyors say, well, if you're not ESG, then you'll be you're being discounted in the premium. So I'm hoping that even though there may be extra costs here, that there's growing confidence that the product that emerges is more valuable, and actually that people won't embark on products that aren't ticking the benchmark, that aren't meeting the benchmark, because they'll be found out at some stage.
And presumably from a marketing angle as well, given the increased interest in living and working in more rural areas, it's going to be a stronger selling point anyway.
Yeah, and I mean, well done to the great estates and the charities that have led this over 20 years and done the hard yards. The Duchy of Cornwall was mentioned earlier. I know the Joseph Rowntree Foundation with their Derwentthorpe development spent a lot of money on researching systems within buildings, so that you can actually send to and dwelling buyers, not just the main legacy message, which is you're buying a stake in a place, but you're actually buying something that the outgoings and the sustainable footprint is going to work a lot better for you. So how more marketable, and you only got to drive around one of these 20-year legacy projects, and then go to the one next door that isn't, and you will see. Never mind ESG or value, just the naked eye will tell you an awful lot.
So if we go to a straightforward tax question for Ian, and it's something that you did touch on, and I guess the answer is going to be, well, it's as long as a piece of string. But the question is, should the sale of the land be VAT registered, and if so, when?
Right. Okay. If I probably the best bet is to start with a couple of examples. So, and the principles. The principle is that unless you do anything, actively do something, the sale of land is exempt from VAT, which means it's outside of the scope of VAT completely. Yeah. So you do not charge VAT on the sale, but you are not allowed to reclaim any of the VAT on the inputs. So if I take an example of someone who might be selling 20 acres for, I don't know, £5 million. And they've had a promoter helping them along the way, and the promoter is going to take 20% of the sale value. What the promoter will do is send an invoice to the landowner for £1 million plus VAT of £200,000 once the sale has gone through. And because land is exempt, the landowner who is selling, if they have done nothing, cannot reclaim the £200,000 of VAT on the promoter's fee. So it's cost them £1.2 million. Equally, they can't have any of the VAT back on their, in comparison, very modest lawyers' and accountants' fees either. So if you're doing something like that, quite often the solution is to opt to tax the land, which effectively means you charge VAT on the sale. So you now sell the land for £5 million plus VAT, and that then allows the seller to reclaim the VAT on the promoter's fee and on all of their other costs, because the land is no longer exempt, it becomes chargeable to VAT. So that's a large sale, and certainly if I've got people who are selling development land, it's one of the things that we talk about. If you then talk about selling land on a small scale, say a farmer selling a field, not for development, probably you would not opt to tax it, because in essence it's sold, it's outside the scope of VAT, The lawyer's fees might be quite modest on a couple of £1,000, let's say. The VAT might be £400, and either they don't get the VAT back, or potentially they do get the VAT back through another method, which is partial exemption calculations through their own farming business. So it very much depends what you're selling, but if you're selling anything substantial and you know that you've got substantial bills coming with it, it's worthwhile discussing opting to tax.
Okay, thank you. Now, probably more of a planning one for Rob. For landowners living in areas of outstanding natural beauty, and I guess other areas as well, there's lots of nice countryside that isn't an AONB. What would you recommend to see? What type of development would you recommend to see those rural villages sort of revived by new development?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because of the AONB, the government takes great store in trying to protect and conserve such designated areas. The Planning Bible, the MPPF, has got a bit on it on para 176 and 177 if anyone's interested. But what you have to demonstrate is that what you're proposing, one, is there a need for it? So you can discuss, if it's a small housing scheme, for instance, with the parish council, what their needs and wants are for the next 10, 20 years. But also, you need to look at the landscape. AONB is quite a key area. So what you do is you get a qualified landscape architect to just assess the quality of the landscape on the particular site and the surrounding area, because councils will always see if that piece of land has a greater significance strategically, and if there is a difference in terms of the compartmentalization of a site, or it's a different character to other parts of the site, there is a case to be made. Now, interesting in AONBs also, if you can provide or deliver local economic benefits, that will actually count towards your proposal. So it's really on a site-specific basis. What is that proposal offering, which would then trigger the fact that could the council consider that to be a positive impact rather than a negative impact on the AONB. So smaller schemes to start with, but it's really a conversation with the parish council first about what they feel about it. They may be able to support you. Not always, of course. It's a longer process, but there are ways and means.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Charlie, I don't know whether you want to comment on that one as well, whether there's any aspect of your work that would touch on that.
Well, not so much. I think Rob's covered the planning side, but I think possibly there's a similar point, Rob, is there about Greenbelt as well. I mean, not all Greenbelt is lovely verdant green, is it? And yes. I think legacy projects are actually a great solution. Yeah. Some of the less Greenbelt.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, in the last 6 months, we've seen some very strange decisions coming out of the planning inspectorate. One case in Hertfordshire's got a few people's attention, where they allowed a residential scheme on a Greenbelt site, which set a few hairs racing. But at the end of the day, it's really about the site specifics, the timing, where the council's housing supply is going or not, as the case may be. So you do have to look at each site on its merits.
Yeah, and as we've said before, if you get the right developer on board, then you can really enhance in this world. The ones that can actually take either a failing bit of Greenbelt or a less contributing AONB and really deliver something special.
Well, I suppose the important thing in all this really is identifying the right promoter, because it's all about the relationship, isn't it, between the landowner and the promoter. They've got to get on, they've got to be able to talk the same sort of language, because if you don't do that from day one, it's not going to work.
Yeah. I mean, if you could just, Ian mentioned promoters, you've mentioned them now, Rob, if you just give a sort of brief outline for those of our audience who perhaps, heard the expression but not completely clear on what the job of a promoter is and where the obligations lie.
Yeah, that's a good question. Interestingly, there's landowners that would like to take their proposals as far through the planning process as they possibly can, and sometimes that's all the way. if they've got the financial backing, they will take it all the way because it's their proposal and their vision. However, on the much larger scale projects, the mixed development projects, you do need the expertise of a promoter to be able to take on some of the risk, and also some of the expertise and knowledge about how you can take a proposal through the system. And I suppose one of the other important factors is they will then instruct a project team, specialists in all kinds of different subjects, including planning, highways, flood risk, ecology, trees, you name it, archaeology. So, as I say, it's really down to the size of the project, the nature of it, the will and commitment of the landowner. They would like to take these things through as best they can, but as Charlie might provide a bit more detail on this, how that relationship is termed legally, because it's got to have all the legal levers and functions, because without the push and pull of agreements, these things aren't going to get through the system, because we don't want anyone to walk away mid through a process and let it all die. So I think really Charlie's better placed in terms of that part of the process.
Before Ian's tax point,
yeah, carry on.
Well, assuming it works from a tax point of view. Yeah, well, I mean, the trouble with promotion agreements is sometimes you've got a very distant promoter, a very distant timescale, and a very distant project. But if you can build in a more proximity and the role, where I was referring earlier to how you build a role in for the original landowner as steward. So in that design period, with his architect alongside, or an architect monitoring the design, and you're going through a role in the construction process as far as you can get it, monitoring or some form of sign off, and then finally a promotion agreement that provides for looking far ahead, but what the management structure is going to be, even if it is just a road and a small path, but one in which the landowner continues to play a role, and it's not just the here you are promoter, go back and see me when you've got the cash. Yeah.
So just to clarify, and I'll bring you in, Ian, if you've got another comment on that. With a promoter, it's always with a view to a sale of the land, is it? Or can you use a promoter simply to promote the site to get the planning in place and then still develop it yourself?
I was just going to make a point that sort of probably might answer that as well, Susie. I mean, I've got a lot of landowners that I deal with as the accountant, and I like promotion agreements for a couple of reasons. Number one, the promoter will take, say, 20% of the sale value of the land when it is sold, but the promoter is generally taking all of the risk. So they put their money up, they put their planning team on it. I had one client who sold for £10 million, but the promoter must have spent somewhere between £500,000 and £1 million up front to get the planning permission, and that was all the promoter's risk. My landowner took no risk whatsoever, apart from, I suppose, maybe trusting their promoter, if you like. That's the risk they're taking. So I like it from that perspective. And I also generally like them. They are generally, Susie, with a view to the sale of the land. And I also like them because what you get at the end of the process is you will get a competitive tender at the end of the process. So you will get a range of people coming in and wanting to buy your land. And certainly, with my business hat on, my feeling, and probably Rob would be better placed than me to say so, but my feeling would be that you maximize value that way.
Yeah, and I would say, yeah, you're right. I mean, you can have, if you've got the right promoter, who could turn up with all the scheme and the architect and the rights and the models that I was saying we'd otherwise build in protections for the landowner to have. If you can see that you've got that sort of developer who, with that sort of team and that sort of vision, and build that in, then yeah, great. Let them get on with it that way, but that way will be prescribed to make sure they're doing it in the legacy way. Yeah. And there are developers out there who do it, and a growing community of them, which is good.
Thank you. Thanks, all. Right, so we've got another question. If you don't have sufficient access to land that could potentially be developed, how can this be dealt with? For example, a housing development's just been built adjacent to land that could be used, but the only other access is a narrow agricultural access. Now, we have to try and sort of use a bit of license to imagine what that situation is, but I think it probably wouldn't be unfamiliar to all three of you, where you've got land that could be developed, but it's a very narrow access and possibly not likely to get permission with the current access. Not sure who props Rob first on that one.
Yeah, I mean, we see it quite a lot, actually. I mean, access is one of what we call one of the showstoppers to development. It's one of the big items that you have to deal with early on. You really do need control over access for your land and proposals. And we find all the time that the standard of the access, if it's below the county requirement, it's really difficult, and that limits the scale of the development from a small access. I mean, you could get some development off that, but it would be small scale. And of course, really, then the adjoining landowners are ransoming you, and they're, you know, some of the value. There's a very important case historically called Stokes v Cambridge, believe it or not, which is used as a benchmark, and percentage of the total development value can be raked in by the adjoining landowner if they allow the individual to use their access through their development, which is obviously a much bigger standard of access, much wider access. So they're in a bit of a cleft stick situation there. You would hope that they might have a good relationship with their landowner friend, but they must realise, I think, they're going to lose some of the value at the end of the day.
What sort of, Rob, just what sort of percentage of value? Because I always have in my head sort of 25 or 30%, yes. But I'm an accountant, not a valuer. So.
Yeah, as a mere town planner, I'm not qualified to give advice on values. That's to my residential surveying colleagues who will be part of the next session. But you are quite right, Ian. I think 30% is the guide that I've been aware of over the years.
Yeah, it's a lot, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, not an easy one to swallow. So I just wondered also, with the increased interest in, I mentioned earlier, rural live workspaces and perhaps more mixed developments. There's lots of criticism of planning law, but do you see anything changing given the increased demand? I know we had the government planning paper last year or the year before looking at zoning, and that all seems to have been put to one side now. Rob, can you see anything really changing given that COVID has changed, the work-life balance for so many people and the way people work? Do you think it's going to promote any change in the planning system?
Well, the planning system, I mean, it tends to be a bit fickle. Depends what's fashionable at the time. And we're seeing a few councils out there saying to us, well, with coronavirus, people aren't going into work as often. You don't need the space that you're planning for, and because it's going to be underused, they're going to be spacing people out, people working from home. So they're actually using it as an excuse against development. But we're seeing gradually a return to the office. People, human beings are social animals after all, so we are finding that people are coming back now in their numbers. So I think it's a blip, but I think going forward people will expect to be able to do that flexible working, and it may have an impact on the space per district required to create jobs. But they'll have to take that into account. And there's no figures out there at the moment because, the Office of National Statistics only can go on what's historical records at the moment. But in the next few years, those figures will be available to be used in evidence. So, I can't answer the question, but I see that hopefully it'll be the type of space and the amount of space that will be an issue.
I suppose I'm thinking more in terms of smaller rural developments where there might be an element of residential, an element of office space, and perhaps some sort of workshops as well, and whether that with a community element would
yes. Well, no, you're right there, because there is, as many of the viewers and listeners will know, new Class E, use classes order, which is flexible use of buildings, which now groups an otherwise non-compliant set of different uses together in one use class, which is going to allow a lot of flexibility of uses of buildings. And I think the rural area will be able to pick up on a lot of this in rural buildings, because they're going to need to do this, to keep the local rural economy going. And I think that mixed development is going to be a tick in the box. I think you could argue much better if you have got a mixed development.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We had a rider to the earlier question I asked about what types of arrangements are proving most beneficial to landowners. That questioner also wanted to know, what should they expect to be paying, what the landowners paying their advisors, or should that largely be covered by those being worked with, where I guess they might mean the developers, but it's not really clear. Any ideas on that?
I can have a go at that one.
Tricky one, yes.
Well, the viewers won't be surprised, because planning is so complicated. And it's very much hard work through the planning process, because there are not the numbers of planning officers that are needed to deal with the state of affairs. And the list of wants and reports and information is ever growing. It doesn't get smaller. And unfortunately, these specialist consultants required to do all these different reports, it's not cheap. And depending on the scale of the scheme, the bigger the scheme is, the more expensive the necessary evidence base is required to support a proposal. And I would say, just very generally, on the bigger schemes, a promoter who is used to this would would agree to do that risk basis of providing that project team and instructing them. And normally I wouldn't suggest a landowner should go down this road, because there's no guarantee they'll get their money, their returns. And I think it's all to do with the scheme and the scale of the scheme.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Just as an example, I had a client show me the quotes that they'd received for a relatively small scheme, so 3 barns to convert into residential units, and I think the initial cost for sort of outline sort of design on the barns, plus all of the surveys which were included, which I didn't realise there was quite so much went into a bat survey. Lots of people turning up at different times of night over the course of a week and doing bat surveys and dealing with the initial application. The professional fees for that came to, I think, about £22,000 plus VAT for 3 barns. But I think that's not the end of the story, if you like. That was the very start of the story to get, I think, the initial planning application made. And then I don't know how easily it would then go through the planning and what the other fees would be, but it wasn't pocket money.
I mean, all I would say is, for the landowners, concentrate on the stopping items first. So access, flood risk and drainage. They're the key ones. And if you can get ticks in the boxes on those, you're on your way to a certain extent, because they're the real difficult showstoppers to negotiate. And if you then got a good story and a good argument to make for the proposal, then the rest will come, and you'll get confidence as you go through the process, and being able to build a bit more confidence through those initial pieces of work.
Okay, thank you. I think we're going to put one of our polls up on the screen now, which the attendees will be able to vote on. When you see that coming up on your screen, if you just respond to that, we'll get an idea of how much people know about legacy development, whether they've been involved in any so far. While that's happening, Charlie, I just wondered if you could sort of talk us through some of the key things where you've advised landowners in the past who want input into a development, whether it's one where they're going to rent space or sell houses or other types of space. What are the sort of key things that the landowners want to see in that development that makes them want to be involved in this way and have some input into it, rather than simply selling off land for development or building out something themselves and then selling it?
Well, sorry, do you mean where as part of the consideration they're having dwellings or units built for them to retain as part of the scheme? Because obviously that certainly has a much greater need for landowner input. And
yes, or where they might be, for example, building to rent space. Yeah.
Well, we're seeing that increasingly diverse consideration. You know, sometimes in the old days it was just a lump sum upfront bit of cash, but increasingly working with the developers on cash flow, phased payments, and, as you say, delivery of some of the dwellings, or if there are small commercial units, getting that. But that, yes, that does involve, there they really are buying a stake and keeping a stake in the as-built project. So making sure that there is proper placemaking and proper design, and that it's going to work as a community.
Yes.
And obviously, a slightly different timescale comes in there, because otherwise a landowner might be more relaxed about the build out or the sale out by the developers, as long as it's known they're being built properly. But obviously, if you want your return of built out units, you want it by a certain date, and that means not just building them, but building everything else, building the public realm, doing the affordable. So there are slightly more issues that come with that. And then you've got to watch the SDLT, as Ian would say, because unless you can hold back the land, the relevant units in some way, and not transfer it over, have it built and then get it back, it's the getting it back that you find you get some unwanted SDLT, I think.
Yeah. You use that expression placemaking. Do you want to just sort of talk a little bit about what that is? It's something that's sort of coming into more common use now, but I think perhaps for some people it might be a new expression.
Yes, I mean, I wouldn't purport to be the definitive definer of it, but it's certainly about everything we've been saying as part of the legacy objective, which is good master planning, good layout, good buildings, good external materials, and that's one, and particularly public realm. And if it's a bigger scale, you know, getting the school right, or getting the commercial right. If it's a small scheme, it's just making sure it's not the never finished public park or the cheapest model, which that's the sort of built aspect of it. And then I think the second element is what then happens. You suddenly find it's full of people who are talking to each other and walking and doing the right things, as opposed to being desolate no-go areas. So that's the second bit of placemaking.
Yeah, I'd second that, Charlie, because placemaking is successful when people continuously use the services and facilities. You know, when people are present, using all the different types of functions on it, that's when it's successful. It's when it's empty and there's no one around, it hasn't worked. So it's really about people using it. And I think when you've got lots of people using this, as you know, it's done its job.
Can either of you give any sort of examples of where something has or hasn't worked to enable that community to develop and use the site in the way that the landowner perhaps hoped it would be?
No.
Well, there's plenty of good examples of
yes,
placemaking. I know I referred earlier to the Prince's Foundation, their website, and BBC and College of Estate Management have got lots of good examples. I mean, look at schools as well. You know, around the school areas, particularly the take up.
I think the key is really that early on you need to establish a certain set of uses, because you're not doing one after the other and waiting years for something to come along before it can be used. So you just have to really think hard about what's needed and how you can get people using that environment early on in the development process, so it's not a wasteland for several years.
Yeah.
I can name some local government examples, but I'm not going to.
No, all right. No, you might have to be talking to them next week. Right, so just to mention the result of our poll, we asked how much do you know about legacy development, and almost half our audience, 48%, knew nothing at all about it, 44% knew a little, and 8% reckon they were well informed on legacy development. So hopefully we've helped in some way tonight on that, and the 2 following webinars will add to what we've heard tonight. Ian, just to go back to the tax angle, are there any real sort of common misunderstandings about tax and development that you have to explain to people when they're thinking of perhaps selling land for development or building themselves?
I think with regard to building themselves, I don't know that it's a misconception, but one of the things that we spend our most time talking about is the change of land use from agricultural, which is inheritance tax free, into sort of either commercial, industrial or residential units, which are inheritance taxable, for the reason that when you give something away, the starting point for tax purposes is that you pay tax on it. So the giftor pays tax on it as if they sold that asset on the open market, unless you have some exemptions. Now, if you're using an asset in your own business like farmland or farm buildings, you've got an exemption and you're allowed to hold over the gain and not pay the tax. But if you've got residential buildings or a courtyard of industrial units, there are no exemptions. Therefore, when it comes to sort of inheritance tax, not only have you made your land and buildings inheritance taxable, you've also made it really quite difficult to give them away, because you have to pay capital gains tax when you make a gift. So we spend quite a lot of time talking about that with clients, either ongoing clients or one-off clients, to try and sort that out before we start. Because if you can get the land into the right ownership in the first instance, or one of the things I quite like using is using a limited company and get the land into a limited company before you start, you can then spread the ownership about the family, and you can mitigate the inheritance tax, but you need to do it early on. So I'm not sure it's a misunderstanding, but it's certainly something that we focus on as accountants, whereas quite often the planners are obviously trying to get the planning permission, the developers are wanting to make a beautiful job, and actually sometimes it's not top of their list who owns the property as long as they're getting paid. So for our angle, it's doing that, and it's looking long term for the family, because you're not looking at something for the next 3 to 5 years, you're looking at the next 30, 50, 70, 80 years. So you've got to start considering really long term planning and the next generation and the generation after that.
Right, thank you. Rob, you mentioned the basics: access, flood risk and drainage. I mean, how common is it for you to be shown a site where you think, no, this just isn't going to work because of 1, 2 or all 3 of those?
Well, no, you have to look at each site closely and get the relevant experts in. So we tend to advise getting, shall we say, efficient, cost-effective consultants in to look at a piece of land very early on, to advise the client, is this feasible or not? And if it's not, what alternatives are there to make it work? And, if there is no control over the access, it's a very difficult task just from day one. I mean, the first thing that's most important, we always ask is, can we see the title, land ownership details? Because that's the first plan that you should always ask for before you start spending the client's money looking at other things, because you just need to know, have they got control of the land plus the service land that's needed to help bring that site along. So the biggest mistakes are that people don't look at the title plan or estate plan first before heading off into the long grass, basically.
Thank you. Charlie, I just wondered if you, coming in sort of on the back of that question, have you been involved in developments where there's been a particular sticking point? I know it's different issues, it's not necessarily planning with you, but where something's caused a problem that perhaps hadn't been expected?
Well, I think the nub of the issue, and it's been picked up in an individual question, and I was trying to get over, is really just the hardest piece is, even though you state quite clearly at the start, this is a legacy project, and set out the aspiration, and you've got design documents that give the detail on that. It's how you balance giving the developer some degree of flexibility, and not to the extent that you get trumped by them. And it's just clearly stating that throughout the development, and indeed even a third-party dispute resolution, has to be on the basis of a vision, and so you're not just getting the commodity result, but setting the parameters of what a third party will define. And we hope it's getting easier, because we are, as we say, these are becoming more identifiable than the past. They're not the one-off projects that they possibly were 20 years ago. And as Rob says, if the planning regime is bringing in elements to ring fence these types of project, then that may make it easier to say it's got to be consistent with those, and so as to protect the design. But that's probably the hardest piece, to make sure that corners aren't cut so as to reduce the quality.
Somebody mentioned biodiversity net gain very early on in the session. I mean, I guess that landowners at least have the advantage of possibly, if they're on a reasonable scale, of being able to meet those obligations more easily perhaps than a developer working on their own.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, Roland Ball, my colleague in the rural division at Bidwell's, this is what he tends to do a lot of now, and it's all about the land bank. So essentially, the bigger the estate you have, the more chance you have of offsetting your biodiversity net gain. So, if you're developing a part of a site and you can't make the uplift of biodiversity net gain work, you can put it on another part of the site if it's suitable. And we're going to find more and more of that as we go forward. And I think, Roland's going to cover that in the third webinar anyway.
Yeah, good. Okay, thank you. Right, we'll just go to, I think, probably our last question. Yeah, this is an interesting one. What can you do to ensure agents or developers are being proactive in promoting your land under the terms of an option agreement? So probably, I think to Rob on that one first.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's really down to the agreement. I think Charles mentioned this common aspirations and objectives agreement between the parties. So basically, at the planning design stage and even earlier, right through to construction and sale, you've got to have these legal agreements in place to ensure that the promoter is doing what they need to do on all fronts to get that proposal through the planning system. Now, what you can find is that sometimes we are retained by a landowner to monitor the work of the promoter, to ensure that they're doing their due diligence to get that plan and proposal through the system in the best way, to make sure every stone is overturned, to look to make sure they're not missing a trick, and every opportunity to get that proposal done early as possible through the system if there's a chance. So, there will be monitoring and checks of the promoter. It will be a key part of it to ensure that they do not go AWOL, as it were, and that they stick to the task.
Right. So probably involves another layer of fees by the sound of it.
Well, I think they're obliged. The promoter can be obliged to pay for those monitoring fees. Is that right, Charlie?
Really? Yeah.
Yeah. That's quite common. That's quite common. Yeah.
Ian, this goes back to, I think you've probably more or less answered this question, but somebody was asking, when does agricultural land lose its agricultural status for taxation and inheritance purposes? There must be quite a fine line where if land is being promoted, it has hope value. It hasn't lost its agricultural value, but it hasn't quite got planning permission. And I guess if it changed hands somewhere in that sort of grey area, it will be quite an argument with HMRC as to what the value was.
Yeah, I think if we take the income tax definition of farming, farming is the occupation of the land for the purposes of husbandry. So if you say what is the farmer doing, they have to do those two things. They have to be occupying the land, and they have to be undertaking husbandry. And therefore, so for example, if you let land out to a third party, you are not occupying the land, so you are not farming that land.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you need to be in occupation. And you then say, well, okay, what is the definition of husbandry? And I don't think I'll go into all the detail here because it's very historic and includes all sorts of weird and wonderful things. But in a practical sense, it is sort of, it's the tilling of the land, if you like, and the growing of crops and the rearing of animals. Okay?
Yeah.
So hence, renting out land, you're not in occupation, but if you are growing a crop of grass, for example, and then somebody else is putting their animals on and eating the grass off, or coming in and cutting the grass and taking it away, you're occupying the land for the purposes of husbandry, you are farming.
Mm-hmm.
The point at which that changes isn't the point at which you put planning permission in or you appoint your promoter or anything like that, because you might very well be occupying the land for the purpose of husbandry all the way throughout.
Right.
However, there is a point at which you are no longer occupying, and that is if you clear the land and you're then going to be developing buildings or developing the land, clearly you're no longer occupying for the purposes of husbandry. There is a change.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if you enter into a lease where you are leasing the land out, so for example, quite a lot of my solar farms, they go for planning. They've already entered into options, and they've already entered into an option that says they will sign a lease once planning has been obtained. They are in occupation of the land up until the point at which the condition is that they must enter into that lease.
Right.
And they're then leasing it out. And it's quite important from a tax angle because, as I said earlier, there's a lot of things you can do with the land whilst you're occupying it for agriculture. The point at which you stop occupying it for agriculture, it becomes more restrictive. So it is quite it's a good question because it's quite an important distinction.
Okay, thank you very much. So one final very quick question. Thank you all very much for your expertise and your time. Looking forward to the next two webinars where we're going to explore different aspects of this a bit further. If you had one piece of advice about legacy development, what would it be, very briefly, because we have to finish very soon? I'll go to Charlie first.
Right. Advance and deliver. That's more of an exhortation than advice. But
right. Yeah. And Rob?
I would say just ensure eventually that your vision, your dream, is a viable one, and obviously you get the returns that you need eventually.
Right, thank you. And Ian, I guess it's going to go back to long-term planning with you, isn't
it? It is. Yeah, assuming it's viable, get it into the right ownership.
Okay, that's great. Thank you all very much, and we'll see some of you again in further webinars in this series, I think. Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.